Stephen Roach was the chief economist of Morgan Stanley, the leading investment bank, for 16 years. But for the past 2 years or more, he's been chairman of Morgan Stanley Asia, casting his penetrating eye on economies that, for the most part, have defied the global recession. We asked him in for tea with the economist to explain to us what these economies need to do to sustain their success.
I wrote The Next Asia because I'm very optimistic on the future of Asia, but I believe strongly that the Asia that's going to drive the global economy is going to have to be very different than the one that exists today. Today you have an export machine supported also by export-led investment. You have very little support from internal private consumption. The Next Asia is all about the shift in the mix of growth from external to internal demand, and it's an exciting but nevertheless a daunting transition that lies in store for the region.
It's going to be a pretty difficult transition, I would think. I mean, almost every economy in Asia is dependent upon exports, not least to the American consumer. The American consumer has been in a bit of trouble. How is this transition going to happen?
The early stages of a multi-year pullback of the American consumer are going to make it very difficult for developing Asia to stay the course with the old model. So it has two choices: slow the growth rate down and run the risks of rising unemployment and social instability, or finally get on with what it says it's wanted to do for a long time, stimulate its internal markets.
Where is that risk going to be biggest? Will it be in China or India or Indonesia? Whereabouts?
Well, I think the biggest challenge will be in China, which is certainly the new engine of pan-regional growth out in Asia. China has extremely high levels of saving, and it's a perfectly legitimate outgrowth of a nation that has eliminated over 60 million jobs due to state-owned enterprise reform, but has done that without having much in the way of a safety net. And so workers save out of fear rather than out of the logic of life cycle planning needs. So China has first and foremost to build out a safety net, and it hasn't done that, but it needs a much bigger investment in Social Security. It needs pension reform. It needs a much more broad-based national health care scheme, and it needs unemployment insurance. And China has taken some steps in that regard, but very small ones.
It seems to me that, obviously there's a need for a stimulus package, particularly if you've got an export-led economy like China and exports are falling. But is China in any sense storing up trouble in the future?
Well, I mean,
if the investment is directed to the domestic economy with creating a bubble perhaps in the housing market?
Look, those are all fair points, but here's the sort of the actual numbers on the stimulus package. 4 trillion RMB package was enacted last October, November. About 72% of that was directed at infrastructure. They then opened the spigots of bank lending dramatically, and fixed investment surged just as the script called for, and it surged so much that it accounted for fully 88% of the total GDP growth. Now, the problem with that is it played into China's existing imbalances. Its investment sector at the end of 2008 was about 42% of GDP, a world record for any economy, let alone China. And now, courtesy of this stimulus, the number is above 45%. So ironically, China, which is a very unbalanced economy, is exacerbating the imbalances, and that is not a sustainable outcome for China or for anybody else. This crisis, to me, is all about the unsustainability of macro imbalances, and China does not get special dispensation from that rule.
I don't know whether this is the assumption in your new book, but it seems generally accepted that the big economies of the next couple of decades will be China and India to a lesser extent. If we go back, say, 20 years, everybody was talking about Japan. What's happened to Japan?
Well, Japan mismanaged its economy, and amazingly enough, the U.S. has pretty much followed the same script. In the late 80s, Japan certainly let the asset markets get away from it, especially property and equities. Enormous bubbles, both of which burst, and 20 years later, the economy is still mired in a post-bubble quagmire with extraordinary stimulus in the system, both from the fiscal and monetary authorities. And if it sounds familiar to you in the context of what's going on in the U.S., it's strikingly familiar. The problem with Japan's bubbles, just like the problem with America's bubbles, is they ended up infecting the real side of the Japanese economy, and that's certainly true in the U.S. And I think, you know, history says it's pretty difficult to pull out of a devastating series of asset bubbles that have subsequently burst.
And did Japan react badly by raising rates at the wrong time, thinking that the burst bubble problem was over?
They tried to shift to somewhat more normal fiscal and monetary policies, and every time they did it, it backfired. And you know, here we are, 20 years later now, debating the exit strategies from the great monetary and fiscal stimulus that's been put in place over the last year. And the experience of Japan shows thus far for post-bubble economies, there is no exit strategy.
No, this is rather scary.
It is.
We've talked a lot about China and the Chinese stimulus and so on. How has India reacted to the crisis?
Well, India is, I think, in terrific shape right now. I think the story for India rests on three key building blocks: micro, macro, and politics. The micro in India has always been superb, in my view, in terms of a large population of world-class companies, a well-educated English-speaking workforce, reasonably solid market institutions, and financial companies, the rule of law, and democracy. Where India has lagged, especially when compared to China, is the macro, but the macro is now getting better. Savings rates are up, foreign direct investment is up. Infrastructure is still a serious problem, though, but hopefully that's on the rise. And the politics, I think, look a lot better. The Congress Party now has a coalition that no longer includes the communists, and so I think they'll be more successful in pushing reforms through over the next several years than they were in the past 5.
So are you, medium and long term, actually more bullish on India than on China?
Look, I've been bullish on China for about 12 years. I'm still bullish on China. I think China, however, now faces some very critical challenges in rebalancing its growth model, and I think China will rise to the occasion. But if they don't rebalance, then there could be some issues from China going forward. India has a more balanced economy, and I'm very constructive on India. And I think the outlook is exceptionally positive over the next several years.
How about the rest of Asia? I mean, we used to talk about the Asian tigers, Singapore, Hong Kong, etc. What's happening there?
Well, post-Asian financial crisis, the late 90s, the rest of Asia, including Japan, by the way, has become an increasingly China-centric region where parts and components are tied very much to the logistics of a China-centric assembly and supply chain, where exports then get shipped out to Europe and the United States. The rest of Asia is doing reasonably well following that model, but as China goes now, so goes Asia. And when Chinese export growth went from +25 to -25 in a 9-month period from sort of mid-2008 to the spring of 2009, the rest of Asia collapsed. So it turns out that Asia is very much a levered play on China's ability to stay the course, and that has its pluses and minuses in this unbalanced world.
So we go back to the unbalanced relationship, in effect, between China and the United States.
I think that's absolutely central to the economic outlook for the global economy over the next few years. You've got one nation that saves too much and spends too little, that's China, and you've got the other large nation who does the opposite, who doesn't save, who borrows from China and spends too much. And we've got to address those imbalances, or we're going to be back in the same mess in the not-so-distant future. And I'm worried that we're really not attending to those imbalances and trying to stimulate an economic recovery.
So how do you think the U.S. now views Asia?
I think the U.S. has mixed feelings in looking to Asia. On the one hand, there's a clear recognition that a savings-short U.S. needs surplus savings from Asia to fund economic growth. On the other hand, middle-class Americans who have had a decade or plus of real wage stagnation, who now have an extremely high unemployment rate, 9.7% or rising, want to point the finger and blame competition from Asia as the source of their problems. And we're beginning to see the saber-rattling of protectionism, which I think is a very worrisome and ominous sign going forward, especially as you're looking to the midterm elections in 2010 in the United States. So I think there's a sort of a real conflict going on in the hearts and souls of Americans with respect to their dependence on Asia.
Steve Roach, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Stephen Roach explaining that the world economy has to be rebalanced, with China in particular boosting its domestic demand, and with America having to curb its addiction to credit and to start saving. Clearly, both East and West have their work cut out.